Alright, I'm here to talk about Honey Creek Elementary School in Georgia. Alright, they were under fire because they were segregating the students. And when parents found out about this, they went and complained to the school board. So, come to find out, they were saying the reason why they were segregating the students because they was doing a report on Ruby Bridges. So, when the kids were going to school, when they got there, they had colored water fountains and they had whites only water fountains. And these kids didn't understand what was going on and why they were being segregated. And so someone got home and told their parents what they were doing. And so I'm going to get into Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was a 6-year-old black girl in 1960 Louisiana. She was the first black child to be integrated into an all-white school, in which that didn't sit well with the residents. And this is why I think myself it was inappropriate to show this to elementary kids. So what they would see during the film was how they threw bottles at her, they called her the N-words, and they just gave her a hard time. As Ruby went into the school, she realized that she didn't have any kids in the classroom, and her only friend was the teacher. And with her teacher being from the north, she didn't agree with segregated laws. And so as that went on, can you imagine a 6-year-old going to school every day, being threatened by parents, and at some point they threatened to poison her, and they would show her pictures of, not pictures, but they would have a black doll in a coffin showing her this is what they'll do to her. For a 6-year-old to go through all of this just to go to school is just sad. And the people that emotionally tortured her is just horrible, And so, as time went on, Ruby finally decided that she wanted to play with the other kids, because sitting in the classroom by yourself all day is not fun, especially for a 6-year-old. And so when they took her on a playground, and she said a little boy came up to her and told him he wanted to play with her, but his mom told him not to play with that N-word girl. And that's really sad, because can you imagine a parent teaching their kids that? That was what it was back in the day. And so, as time went on, finally, some students actually wanted to play with her because they was just kids. As she got to play with them, she realized there was much difference than her and them. And all of this happened to Ruby because of the color of her skin. Not because she was sick, not because she had done anything. This was seriously because she was a black girl. And, during that Jim Crow era, that's what it was about. It was mostly about race. And for elementary school students to learn this, it's just too early. It's just they're not ready to take on what happened during the Jim Crow era. Because when you go back to the Jim Crow era, there's blood. There's lots of blood on that. Well, blacks, they had little rights. They didn't have probably much rights as a dog. And so what would these kids would see if when they Googled Jim Crow laws was just horrible. To me, I feel like that's the reason why they want to delete history, because they don't want people to see what happened during the Jim Crow era. And so when you try to delete history, so you just going to throw Martin Luther King's legacy out. You're going to take away his sacrifices, not only the sacrifices that he made. You have, I guess Medgar Evers, he died for no reason during civil rights struggle, right? And so you're going to take away from Jimmy Lee Jackson his sacrifice and why he was murdered. And not to mention the 3 boys that from upstate New York and Philadelphia, Mississippi, they came down to get blacks to urge them to vote because that is their rights, and they were killed. That's sacrificing on civil rights. And Jim Crow murdered a lot of innocent black people and some white for simply trying to fight for their rights. It was so bad at one point where JFK saw the beating of protesters. I think it was in Alabama, and it got to a point to where he decided, I'm gonna go on live TV. I'm gonna call Congress out for them to integrate the South, because it was just so much horrible things done to black people during that time, including Miss Ruby Bridges. A 6-year-old going to school every day, facing racial threats, death threats, all simply because she was trying to go to school and learn just like every other kid was. And it wasn't the kids that Miss Ruby was concerned about, it was the parents that came after her. And for them to sit down, try to figure out a way to erase history, that would be a big error. for the United States. You can't hide what happened. Jim Crow. People need to know why they were segregated against. People need to know what Jim Crow, why Martin Luther King marched. I'm really fully against that elementary school showing this type of thing to those kids, because little kids at that age, they take in everything, especially something like this. So now you have kids going to school feeling like, okay, we should use different water fountains because he's black, I'm white, and that was just wrong. And I really hope whoever was in charge of that gets some type of punishment, because what you did, you ruined the kids. Because now they're going home asking mom and dad questions about should they do this with segregation or should they keep doing this. These are kids, because they take in everything like that, and especially something like that. They're going to try to enforce it on their own because that's what they're taught. Because I always said this, racism is taught. You're not born with it, it's taught. And I believe what that school did, Honey Creek Elementary, was teaching these kids racism. At least you wait till they get in high school. That's something you do with high school students, because high school students are at the age to where they can understand what was going on in Jim Crow era. Because the Jim Crow era was a horrible era for blacks. Blacks dealt with a lot of injustice, innocent murders, and it was just too much for a child to take on to. Because see, me, I remember when I was like 10 years old and I first read the Emmett Till story. It was this book called Freedom Children, and when I opened up and read it, the first thing that I seen on there was the Emmett Till story. So as I read it, I read how this 14-year-old boy was lynched because he was accused of whistling to a white woman. And the way they murdered him was so savage. I mean, it just took me away, and I was 10 years old. And that started to make me think about stuff like I shouldn't think about certain people. And not only that, when the civil rights era, you also have to think about Willie Howard, George Stinney Jr. They were murdered innocently, and they were just 14 years old, just off of accusations. And so when you show a child Jim Crow era, things like Ruby Bridges, even the Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine, you just got to see what they went through. They integrated the school in Arkansas, and their situation was pretty much worse than Ruby Bridges. Because I'll tell you why. It's not. They had to worry about the students, in some cases the teachers, and they had to worry about the parents attacking them simply because of the color of their skin. And all these kids was trying to do was just learn. Because back in the day, black schools weren't funded at all. They was pretty much put together by people in the neighborhood. They could only teach up to 3rd or 4th grade, just where you learn the basic stuff, and then pretty much they was on their own. So you can imagine being a grown man with the second and 3rd grade education. And so that was more of a reason why they needed to get in, public schools, with the white kids, because they couldn't learn much in the black schools, because black schools didn't have the money to keep going, do high school graduation. They didn't. They only taught them the basic math, reading, and some kids didn't even make it that far. And and that just created, a race of illiterate people. And so that's why the civil rights will be so important to why we had to fight for our rights, especially in Jim Crow era. It wasn't easy. The school in Georgia, to show elementary kids things like Ruby Bridges, their mind isn't big enough to understand what was going on. They couldn't even act it out. I just really feel like Jim Crow is something that you have to understand as you get older, because learning about Jim Crow as a black kid, it'll spook you out. It'll have you looking at people different. That's just what I feel. Because when I read the Emmett Till story, it messed me up. It made me look at people a certain way, like, gosh, and they really done it. And as you know, Georgia back in the day was one of the main segregated states. They supported segregation, and they even lynched black people that even tried to stand up in their rights. I mean, you can look it up. It'll tell you all about it. And it didn't surprise me that it was a school in Georgia just because the roots in Georgia. As I sit here and say, I just felt like I disagreed with Honey Creek Elementary of segregating the students at that age, especially 9 and 10-year-olds, and I understand it. Even in high school, you don't segregate them. You make a play, so people understand what you're doing and what's going on. So I highly disagree with Honey Creek Elementary in their stance on segregation, because when you look at the Jim Crow era, that's not even something that you want to play with, because so many lives have been lost, for the fight for civil rights. With the United States, trying to come together and figure out a way to erase history, you don't just erase history, you erase the hard work and dedication of every civil rights leader that died in the struggle, even JFK, even Abraham Lincoln. Like, you just want to say he never existed? It doesn't make sense. People need to understand their history and know what went on, and how racism just always have played a part in America. I think nowadays we're doing better with racism because, everybody's trying to figure out a way to denounce it. But I still feel like a lot of people that was born in the Jim Crow era, they still want to live it. And that's the problem with everybody right now. They still feel like they can bring racism back like it's a Jim Crow era. And it's just ridiculous for adults to even think that way, especially when we see what happened to Ruby Bridges. He was just a 6-year-old girl just wanting to go to school and learn, and they even threatened to poison her. It got to a point to where she would eat food that was her mom had to bring to her because she was afraid of being poisoned. And these were the adults doing this to a 6-year-old, not the children. These were the adults. And, as I said earlier, the kids wanted to play with her, but it was just the parents telling them, do not play with that N-word. But that's just a part of American history. And that's just horrible to even know that. That's why, I did this video about, Ruby Bridges and Honey Creek Elementary. So just let me know in the comments if you agree and disagree with what they did with the students at Honey Creek Elementary. Did it confuse them, or did it tell them something?